In 1985, a solo female explorer named Lena Whitcomb vanished from the foggy forests of Oregon. For 15 agonizing years, her family held onto hope, her mother keeping a porch light burning every single night. Search parties found nothing. It was as if the wilderness had simply swallowed her whole. But the entire time, her younger brother Mike was hiding a devastating secret. Then, 15 years later, he finally makes a chilling confession to police. His sister didn't just disappear, he helped her run. He admits he's been holding onto a key she gave him that night. A key to a dusty bus station locker that holds the real truth. But what could make a woman fake her own disappearance? And what secret was so dangerous she had to stay hidden for over a decade? Tap subscribe so you don't miss what we find inside that locker. And drop your city and local time in the comments. It's always fun to see our map light up. In the autumn of 2000, 15 years after Lena Whitcomb walked into the Oregon pines and never walked out, the basement of the Cedar Ridge Community Church smelled of dust, mothballs, and weak coffee. It was the annual fall rummage sale, a familiar ritual in a town that clung to its routines like a sailor to a mast in a storm. Fluorescent lights hummed over long folding tables piled high with the gentle ghosts of other people's lives. Porcelain dolls with cracked smiles, stacks of Western paperbacks, clothes that had long gone out of style. Mike Whitcomb was there, as he was every year, helping the ladies from his mother's choir. He was 39 now, his hands calloused from the auto shop he ran, his face settled into the quiet, patient lines of a man who expects little and is rarely disappointed. He was folding a metal chair with a loud metallic clank when the sound happened. It wasn't a loud sound. It was a small, sharp clink of brass on particle board, but it cut through the low murmur of the room and found him. A volunteer, a sweet-faced woman named Mrs. Gable, had just tipped a red plastic donation bin onto a sorting table. Out tumbled a jumble of junk, a ceramic frog, a bundle of yellowed crochet hooks, a single baby shoe, and the compass? It was a simple brass field compass, the kind a serious hiker would carry. It lay there, glinting under the humming lights. Mike froze, the half-folded chair still in his hand. From across the room, he could see the etching on the lid, tarnished but unmistakable. 2 letters, carved with a steady, deliberate hand. L.W. The chair slipped from his grip and clattered to the linoleum floor. No one seemed to notice. Mike moved toward the table, his feet feeling heavy and distant, the sounds of the rummage sale fading into a dull, rushing sound in his ears. He reached out and picked up the compass. It was cool and heavy in his palm, a solid piece of his past made real. He turned it over and over, his thumb tracing the familiar grooves of the initials. His sister had carved them herself with the tip of a file one summer afternoon, sitting on the porch steps, the scent of cut grass hanging in the air. He'd watched her, a skinny 14-year-old kid in awe of his big sister who knew how to read the land. He palmed the compass, closing his fist around it, and stepped out of the main room into the quiet of a back hallway. Under the weak, dusty glow of a single bare bulb, he opened his hand. He stared at the 2 letters, and a name pushed its way up from a place he'd kept locked for 15 years. He didn't mean to say it aloud, but it came out anyway, a ragged whisper that was swallowed by the cinder block walls. Lena. From the doorway of the main room, Ruth Whitcomb heard it. At 66, her hearing wasn't what it used to be, but a mother's ear is tuned to the frequency of her children's pain. She had been arranging a tray of cookies, her movements slow and graceful, but the sound of her son whispering his sister's name stopped her cold. She looked over and saw him standing alone in the hallway, his broad shoulders slumped, staring at something in his hand. She saw his face, pale and stricken, and the quiet grief she had carried with such dignity for a decade and a half threatened to crack her right open. She steadied herself with a hand on the doorframe, the full weight of 20 porch light years settling into the lines around her eyes. Someone else was watching, too. Detective Nora Halloran, off duty and attending the rummage sale to buy a pie in support of the church choir, had been chatting with the pastor. She'd known the Whitcombs for years, first as the young, driven detective on Lena's case, and later as just another face in a small town. But her professional instincts never truly slept. She saw Mike drop the chair. She saw his beeline to the table. And now she saw his hands shaking as he stood in the hallway. This was not a man finding a sentimental trinket. This was a man finding a ghost. Halloran excused herself and walked over, her expression calm and neutral. "Mike, you all right?" Mike looked up, his eyes wide and unfocused. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He just held out his hand, showing her the compass. Halloran took a step closer, her gaze sharp and methodical. She saw the initials, L.W. She read softly. Lena Whitcomb. It wasn't a question. Mike just nodded, swallowing hard. I recognize it," he stammered, his voice thick. "She had it with her. She always had it." He paused, and the next words changed everything. "I last held it the night she asked me to." Halloran's friendly, off-duty demeanor vanished, replaced by the quiet, intense focus of a homicide detective. The air in the hallway grew still and heavy. This was not charity chatter anymore. This was evidence. "What night, Mike?" she asked, her voice low and even. Ruth had moved to her son's side, her hand on his arm, her eyes fixed on the small brass object that had just thrown a grenade into their quiet life. From somewhere deep inside him, the truth began to claw its way out. "The night she disappeared," Mike said, the words tasting like rust in his mouth. He looked from the detective to his mother, his face a mask of old guilt. "There's more. I have something at home. A key. She gave it to me that night. I've had it since 1985. Ruth's hope, a feeling she thought had withered to a dry husk, flared so brightly it hurt. It was a physical pain in her chest, the agony of a wound being torn open with the slim, terrible chance it might finally be cleaned. "Michael," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "What else?" Halloran's eyes were locked on Mike. She didn't press. She just waited. She knew a confession, once started, has its own gravity. Mike looked at his mother, at the years of unanswered questions in her face, and the dam of his 15-year promise finally broke. He said the sentence that flipped the world on its axis. "She called me," he whispered, the secret finally released into the air. "She called me after she vanished." The hum of the fluorescent lights in the other room seemed to roar in the sudden, ringing silence. Vanished. The official story. The lie he had helped create. Halloran took a slow breath. "Mike, I need you to come down to the station. We need to take a formal statement." But Ruth shook her head, her grip tightening on her son's arm. Her home had been a place of waiting, of quiet mourning. Now it would be a place of truth. "No," she said, her voice regaining its steady, anchoring tone. "We do it at the house. With coffee." Halloran looked at the mother, the son, and the small brass compass sitting in the center of it all, like a tiny, powerful sun, pulling a dead past back into a living orbit. She nodded. "Okay, Ruth." At the house. As they walked out of the church, leaving the pies and the chatter behind, the compass remained in Mike's tightly clenched fist. A cold, hard promise of a story that was far from over. To understand what Mike's confession really meant, you have to go back to a cool, misty Saturday morning on June 8th, 1985. Back to Lena Whitcomb's last known day. Lena was a creature of habit and precision. She was a field technician who collected trail data, and she moved through the world as if she were drawing a map of it. That morning, in the small kitchen of the house she shared with her mother, she filled out a carbon copy hike plan card. It was a system she'd created herself. She listed her intended route, the North Fork Loop, her estimated return time, and the gear she was carrying. She left the top copy under a strawberry-shaped magnet on the refrigerator, a silent witness for anyone who might come looking. before lacing up her boots. She set the tiny alarm on her digital wristwatch for her standard check-ins, little beeps that would remind her to pause, drink water, and check her position. On her topographic map, a beautiful thing of tight, swirling lines, she used a sharpened pencil to draw a tiny, almost invisible cross next to a place called Switchback 12. It was a detail no one would understand for 15 years. Her day began like any other. A gas receipt from the station on the edge of town was time-stamped 8:13 a.m. The weather was mild, the sky a soft, hazy gray with the promise of sun later. When she pulled her blue Subaru into the trailhead parking lot, it was quiet. The air smelled of damp earth and pine. The only other vehicles were a nondescript white panel van parked at the far end and a dusty, family-style station wagon that looked like it had seen better days. At the ranger kiosk, she signed the logbook in her tight, neat print. Lena Whitcomb, North Fork Loop, solo, returned by dark. A fisherman getting his gear out of his truck saw her step onto the trail. He'd later tell police he remembered her because she looked so capable, so at home in the wilderness. She had her brass compass on a lanyard around her neck and a sturdy cardboard map tube strapped to her pack. She gave him a brief, polite nod, and then she was gone, disappearing between the tall, silent pines. The first few hours of the hike were uneventful. The trail climbed steadily, and the only sounds were the hiss of the wind through the high branches and the rhythmic crunch of her boots on the trail. But as the day wore on, things began to feel off. Around midday, the wind picked up, coming in cold gusts that scoured the path. She noticed the boot prints on the trail were no longer just her own. Ahead of her, pressed deep into the dirt, were the tracks of wider-lugged boots. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. She was a solo hiker, but she wasn't alone on this mountain. On a high ridge spur that gave her a clear view of the valley below, she paused to make a note in her field log. She saw a landmark, a metal sign for mile 23 on the Forest Service road below, and noted that it was misaligned, tilted at an odd angle, as if it had been tampered with. And it was there, looking down, that she saw it. Through a break in the trees, she could see a small, makeshift camp. A canvas banner, flapping in the wind, was strung between two trees. The lettering was cheerful, hand-painted, North Fork Youth Treks. It was the station wagon that drew her attention, the same dusty one from the trailhead parking lot. She saw a man, his back to her, loading a small child into the back seat. The child, a little boy no older than 3, was clutching a stuffed dog. There was nothing overtly wrong with the scene, but some deep, primal instinct inside Lena went on high alert. It was the hurried, almost furtive way the man moved. It was the way the child seemed limp, too quiet. Her training, her meticulous nature, took over. She unslung her pack, pulled out the Polaroid camera she used to document trail conditions, and raised it to her eye. The camera whirred and spat out a square of film. As the image slowly bloomed into color, the toddler, the stuffed dog, the side of the station wagon, she used a pen to write on the white frame below the picture. Just 3 characters she could make out on the license plate. 7N4. Something was wrong here. She didn't know what it was, but she had a record of it now. A piece of undeniable proof. The final official trace of Lena Whitcomb came at 1:17 p.m. A record from a payphone at a Dusty Canyon General Store, miles from where she was supposed to be, showed a 60-second call was placed to her brother Mike's auto shop. In that call, she used a code word they'd agreed on as kids, a silly phrase to signal danger without alerting anyone who might be listening. North wind. After that, silence. By evening, her Subaru was still sitting alone in the darkening trailhead lot. The alarm was raised. The search began on day 2. Teams of volunteers and law enforcement scoured the North Fork Loop. Scent dogs followed her trail from the kiosk, up the path and onto the ridge. And then, right at Switchback 12, The same spot she had marked with a tiny cross on her map. The trail went cold. The dogs grew confused, circling and whining, the scent completely erased by the scouring wind. It was as if she had simply stepped between the trees and ceased to exist. Detective Nora Halloran, young and new to the area back then, stood at that windy switchback and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. In her official notebook, surrounded by the dry facts of the case, she wrote a private observation, a gut feeling that would haunt her for years to come. Ordinary place, she wrote. Secret movement. The Whitcomb kitchen table had been the center of their family's life for 30 years. It had held birthday cakes, homework, and stacks of bills. For the last 15, it had held a silent, waiting grief. Now it held 3 people, 2 coffee mugs, and a tiny brass compass that seemed to bend the light in the room around it. Detective Nora Halloran placed a small, black microcassette recorder on the polished wood. The click it made as she pressed the record button was unnervingly loud in the quiet room. Ruth sat perfectly still, her hands wrapped around her mug. Though she wasn't drinking, she just watched her son. Mike stared at the compass, not at the 2 women sitting with him. He cleared his throat, and the sound was rough, unused. That afternoon, he began, his voice low and strained. June 8th. She called the shop, from the payphone at the Canyon store. He took a shaky breath. She said one thing first. North wind. It was our code. From when we were kids. It meant trouble. But the kind you can't talk about on the phone. The kind where someone might be listening. Halloran's face was unreadable, her pen poised over her notebook. She didn't rush him. She let the silence stretch, giving him the space to pull the story from wherever he'd buried it. She told me not to call the police, Mike continued. Not yet. She said she needed my help. She asked me to pick her up at midnight at the old trackside bus depot. She told me to bring a plain coat, one nobody would recognize, and a pair of scissors. He finally looked up, his eyes pleading with his mother for an understanding he didn't deserve. I did it. I didn't ask questions. I just did it. I got to the depot a little before midnight. It was deserted, just a couple of flickering lights. And she was there, waiting in the shadows, by the baggage claim. She was pale, and her eyes were wide. But she wasn't hurt, not in the way you think of hurt. She was just different. Fierce. He described how she took the coat without a word and put it on, pulling the hood up. Then she took the scissors. Right there, in the dim, yellow light of the depot, she grabbed handfuls of her long, dark hair and began to cut, hacking at it until it was short and jagged around her face. It was a shearing, a deliberate destruction of the person everyone knew. When she was done, she looked like a stranger, a fugitive. She handed me her compass, Mike said, his gaze dropping back to the brass object on the table. She closed my hand around it and said, "Keep this, Mike, forever, so you'll have it." Then she gave me something else. He paused, the memory sharp and painful. A small key. She pressed it into my palm and made me look at her. She said, 15 years. I didn't understand. I asked her what she meant. She just said it again and made me repeat it. Promise me. 15 years. The weight of that promise filled the small kitchen. The promise that had forced him to lie to the search teams, to his friends, to his own mother. He described driving her the few blocks to where the 2 a.m. Greyhound bus was idling, its engine a low rumble in the night. He watched her buy a ticket with cash, a ticket to nowhere he could name. He watched her board the bus and find a seat by a dirty window. She looked out at him just once, and she didn't smile or wave. She just gave a single, sharp nod. It was the nod of a soldier going over the wall, not a sister saying goodbye. I went home, Mike whispered, his voice cracking. The next day, the calls started. I lied. To everyone. I lied to you, Mom. I lied to you, Detective. For 15 years, I watched you keep that porch light on, And I knew she wasn't lost in the woods. I knew she was gone. The confession hung in the air, heavy and toxic. There was more, he added, as if punishing himself with the full truth. Every year, on June 8th, a postcard would arrive. No return address. The postmark was always smudged, unreadable. There were never any words. Just a small, hand-drawn compass rose in the corner, inked in black. Halloran finally spoke, her voice calm but with a steel edge. "Where are these postcards, Mike?" Mike shook his head, a fresh wave of failure washing over him. "I kept them. In an old cigar tin. I kept the tin under the front seat of my work truck. I sold that truck 3, maybe 4 years ago. I forgot all about it until right now. Obstruction of justice, aiding a fugitive, lying on a police report." Halloran could list the charges in her head, but she also saw the broken man in front of her, a man who had been crushed under the weight of a vow made to a sister he loved. The room held both truths at once, the crime and the suffocating loyalty that caused it. Ruth had not moved. She had listened to the entire story, to the 15 years of secrets and lies, without a single interruption. Her son's betrayal was a fresh, deep wound on top of an old, scarred one. But when she finally spoke, her voice was not one of grief. It was one of pure, unbending resolve. She looked past her son, past his shame, and straight at the truth that was finally within reach. "Get the key, Michael," she said, her voice clear and strong, cutting through all the pain. "We're done hiding." Mike looked at his mother, stunned by her strength. He pushed his chair back, went to a drawer in the hall sideboard, and came back with a small, gray felt pouch, the kind used for jewelry. He upended it onto the table. Out slid a small, tarnished metal key. It lay next to the compass, glinting like a tiny, cold moon. Stamped into the brass was a simple, stark code. CR17. The old trackside bus depot wasn't a depot anymore. The buses had stopped running through Cedar Ridge a decade ago, and the building had been converted into a climate-controlled storage facility. The new owner, a man with a gray ponytail and a Grateful Dead t-shirt, was skeptical when Detective Halloran showed him the tarnished key, but a quick flash of her badge was enough to secure his cooperation. He led Halloran, Mike, and Ruth through clean, brightly lit hallways to a forgotten corner in the back. There, against a dusty wall, stood a bank of old metal lockers, relics from the depot's glory days. They were dented and scratched, painted a faded industrial green. The manager squinted at the key. "CR17, he mumbled. "Yeah, that's one of the old ones. Haven't been opened in years. We just left 'em. More trouble than they're worth to clear out." Halloran took the key. The air was thick with the smell of old metal and dust. Mike stood a few feet back, his hands shoved in his pockets, his face tight with anticipation. Ruth stood beside him, her posture ramrod straight, her eyes fixed on the small, square locker door. She had waited 15 years for this moment. She could wait a few seconds more. Halloran inserted the key into the lock. It resisted, gritty with age. She had to jiggle it, working it back and forth. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed like it wouldn't turn. Then, with a reluctant groan of metal on metal, the tumblers yielded. Halloran turned the latch, and the door swung open on a long, thin iron sigh. The space inside was small, dark, and smelled of dry paper and time. It wasn't empty. Lying flat on the metal shelf was a long, cardboard map tube, the kind architects and engineers use, tied shut with a loop of thick, wax-coated thread. Beside it sat a standard C60 cassette tape in a clear plastic case, and next to that, lying face up, was a single Polaroid photograph. Halloran, careful not to disturb anything more than necessary, reached in and gently retrieved the items one by one. She handed the Polaroid to Ruth. It was the picture Lena had taken on the ridge. A small boy, with dark, serious eyes, clutching a worn, stuffed dog. In the background, out of focus, was the side of the dusty station wagon, and the partial license plate, 7N4. Ruth stared at the image of the unknown child, her heart aching with 1,000 questions. Who was he? And what did he have to do with her daughter's disappearance? Mike peered over his mother's shoulder, his breath catching in his throat. He recognized it instantly from Lena's frantic whispered description of that last day. Halloran examined the map tube, but didn't open it. The wax-threaded tie was a seal, a message in itself. She turned her attention to the cassette. It was the most promising, the most immediate link to Lena. She'd brought the small micro-cassette recorder from the house. With steady hands, she popped open the cassette's plastic case, took out the tape, and placed it in the recorder. The silence in the storage facility hallway was absolute as she pressed the play button. First, there was a click. Then, a soft hiss of blank tape. And then, a voice. A voice no one in that hallway had heard in 15 years. It was Lena. Her voice was clear, steady, and factual, completely devoid of panic. She sounded exactly like she did when she was guiding a ridge walk, pointing out landmarks. Her tone professional and calm. June 8th, 1985. The voice began. Field log, supplemental. If you are hearing this, Mike, it means I'm okay. I'm safe. If someone else is hearing this, and it's before June of 2000, something has gone wrong. But if the 15 years have passed, then open the map. The sound of Lena's voice, so alive, so present, filled the sterile hallway. Ruth closed her eyes, tears finally tracing paths down her cheeks. She reached out and touched the tape player, her fingers resting on it as if she could feel her daughter's presence through the plastic. Mike just stared, his face a mixture of awe and profound relief. Lena's recorded voice continued, a calm, damning indictment. I stumbled onto something at the North Fork trailhead. A group calling themselves North Fork Youth Treks. It's a front. I saw them moving children at odd hours, using the camp as a cover. I believe they are falsifying guardianship papers. It's a custody scheme of some kind. She then read out the details she had gathered with chilling precision. Plate fragments from a beige station wagon. 7 November 4. Their routine seems to be a vehicle swap near the Mile 23 sign on the Forest Service Road, late on a Friday or Saturday. The banner at their camp was purchased from Carver's Outfitters. I found the half receipt. It's in the tube. The name hung in the air. Wade Carver, a pillar of the Cedar Ridge community. A charismatic man who ran a successful outfitting business and donated generously to every local cause. The idea was unthinkable. Lena's voice concluded with a final, chilling instruction. The map in the tube shows the location of a second cache, a disused rail tunnel below the trail, a place the old-timers call Angel's Mouth. If I don't make it back, everything you need is there. I'm sorry, Mike. I love you. The tape clicked off, plunging the hallway back into silence. The three of them stood frozen for a moment, the weight of Lena's words settling upon them. She hadn't vanished. She had gone to war. Halloran's face was hard as stone. She'd seen this before. Custody scams papered over with glossy camp brochures and community goodwill. It was a clean, quiet kind of evil. Ruth looked at the detective, her eyes clear now. The grief was still there, but it was joined by a fierce, burning purpose. Well, Nora, she said, what's our next step? Halloran didn't hesitate. She carefully placed the cassette and the Polaroid into evidence bags. She picked up the sealed map tube. Our next step, she said, her voice grim, is we take a hike to Angel's Mouth. The next morning dawned cold and gray, the sky the color of wet cement. Detective Halloran didn't want a spectacle. She took only a uniformed forest ranger and Mike Whitcomb with her. Ruth stayed home, the map tube Lena had left sitting on her kitchen table like a sacred text. They drove to the North Fork trailhead, the same place Lena had parked her Subaru 15 years earlier, but they didn't take the main trail. Following the precise annotations on Lena's map, which Halloran had carefully unsealed and photographed, they found an old, overgrown spur trail that led down into a steep ravine. The air grew damp and cool, thick with the smell of moss and decaying leaves. After a 20-minute descent, scrambling over slick rocks and fallen logs, they found it. Half hidden by a curtain of hanging moss and ferns was the dark, gaping maw of an old railroad tunnel. Angel's Mouth, the ranger said, his voice low. Hasn't been used since the logging bust in the 50s. According to Lena's notes, the cache was not deep inside, but near the entrance. Her map had a small red X marked next to a notation. Loose stone, west wall, 30 paces in. Mike, his face grim, counted out the steps. The air inside the tunnel was frigid, and their breath plumed in the beams of their flashlights. At 30 paces, they swept their lights along the damp, curving rock wall, and there it was. A single, flat stone that was a slightly different color and texture from the others around it. It was set so perfectly, it was almost invisible. Mike pried at it with his fingertips, and it came loose with a soft grating sound, revealing a dark, square niche behind it. Tucked inside the niche was a metal tin, the kind that once held biscuits, carefully wrapped in a thick sheet of oilcloth to protect it from the damp. Halloran, wearing gloves, gently lifted the tin out. It was heavy. She carried it back to the mouth of the tunnel, into the gray morning light, and opened the lid. The contents were a testament to Lena's methodical mind. It was a treasure trove of evidence, a prosecutor's dream. There was a stack of camp rosters from North Fork youth treks, and next to them, photocopies of what looked like parental consent forms. But a quick glance showed the signatures were clumsy, some clearly traced, others forged with a shaky, unpracticed hand. There was a detailed route sheet, logging dates and times of trips to the Mile 23 swap, with a set of initials at the bottom of each page. E. R. Most damning of all was a small, coiled piece of rope, the kind used for banners. Its fibers, a perfect match for the half receipt from Carver's Outfitters that was also in the tin. The chain of evidence was now complete, a series of undeniable physical links. It started with a key, led to a voice, which led to a map, which led to this. Receipts, maps, rosters, plate fragments, and a physical location. Halloran knew she had enough. It was time to move. They went public, but they did it carefully. Halloran held a quiet press conference, laying out only the barest of facts. That new evidence had come to light in the 1,985 disappearance of Lena Whitcomb, and that it pointed to a now-defunct youth program run by local businessman Wade Carver. She didn't mention the children or the forged papers. She was building a wall, brick by brick, and she didn't want to give Carver any ammunition to tear it down. But she had underestimated him. Wade Carver didn't hide. He didn't release a statement through a lawyer. Instead, he held his own press event on the steps of the town hall. He stood there, tan and confident, flanked by some of the town's most respected figures. He spoke with a voice full of sorrow and righteous indignation. He called the investigation a tragedy, a desperate and misguided smear campaign by a grieving family, enabled by an overzealous detective. He painted Mike as a tormented soul, clinging to conspiracy theories. He produced glossy brochures from the old days, filled with pictures of smiling children on hikes. He spoke of his years of service to the community, his voice trembling with sincerity. And it worked. The town, which had been reeling from the initial news, was now confused. It was easier to believe in the Wade Carver they knew, the man who sponsored the Little League team, than in the monster Halloran was describing. Then, things got worse. Someone leaked the fact that Mike had lied to police in 1985, that he'd known his sister was alive all along. The story he'd told at the kitchen table was now public, and it split Cedar Ridge right down the middle. One half saw a loyal brother honoring a desperate vow. The other half saw a man who had obstructed justice for 15 years, a liar whose entire story was now suspect. The backlash was quiet but brutal. At the grocery store, people would stop talking when Ruth Whitcomb walked down the aisle. A friend from her church choir pulled her aside after practice and whispered, "Ruth, people are talking. They're saying difficult things." The pressure was mounting. Then came the next blow. Evan Ross, the man whose initials ER were on the route sheets, vanished. The day after Carver's press conference, police went to his small trailer on the edge of town to question him. The trailer was empty, the front door standing wide open, a cheap box fan still turning in the window, stirring the dusty air. He was gone. The district attorney, a cautious man with an election coming up, began to hesitate. He called Halloran into his office. "Nora, this is falling apart," he said, gesturing to a pile of local newspaper clippings praising Carver. "The evidence is old. It's circumstantial. Mike's lie has poisoned the well. Right now, this looks more like a civil matter, not a criminal one." It was the familiar stall, the bureaucratic retreat in the face of public pressure. The case was in danger of being buried all over again, this time by doubt and insinuation. That night, a storm rolled through Cedar Ridge, lashing the town with wind and rain. On the Whitcombs' front porch, the single bulb that had burned faithfully every night for 15 years finally gave out, fizzling in a brief flash of blue light and plunging the porch into darkness. Ruth, watching from the window, felt a cold dread creep into her heart. With shaking hands, she found a new bulb and went out into the storm to replace it, her face streaked with rain that mixed with her tears. While the court of public opinion was turning against the Whitcombs, Detective Halloran was doing what she did best. She was digging. She ignored the noise and the politics and went back to the paper trail. The forest ranger who had guided them to Angel's Mouth remembered something: the old trailhead sign-in books. They were packed away in a dusty archive at the ranger station. Halloran spent an entire afternoon sifting through a decade's worth of logbooks, her fingers stained with dust and ink, and then she found it. The book from 1985. She flipped to the page for June 8th. There was Lena's neat signature, and several lines below it, another entry. The time was 2:13 a.m. The signature was Wade Carver's. He had signed out of the trailhead in the middle of the night on the very day Lena disappeared. On its own, it meant nothing. But Halloran, ever meticulous, cross-referenced the signature with receipts from Carver's shop that she'd pulled from old case files. The ink, the slant of the letters, it was a perfect match. More importantly, it established a pattern. Carver had a habit of being in odd places at odd hours, a habit that contradicted his public image as a straightforward, daylight person. It was a crack in the wall. And then the crack widened. Evan Ross, the driver who had vanished, was not a bad man. He was a weak man, cornered by debt and a misplaced sense of loyalty. But Lena's story, now filtering through the news, had planted a seed of conscience in him. Hiding out in a cheap motel 2 states away, he saw a picture of Ruth Whitcomb on television, her face etched with a quiet, dignified pain, and something inside him broke. He made a call. An hour later, he was sitting across from Halloran in a sterile interview room, a tape recorder running between them. He told her everything. He described the midnight runs to the Mile 23 turnout. He talked about the children, always quiet, always sleepy, who he was told were temporary placements for an expedited guardianship program. He insisted he thought it was all legal, that Carver had shown him paperwork that looked official. He confirmed the beige station wagon, even naming its real owner, a cousin of Carver's who lived out of state. He confirmed the partial plate, 7N4. But the most important thing he gave them was a location. He told them about a secret ledger, a detailed record of payments and placements that Carver kept hidden in a small hunting cabin he owned deep in the woods. He even drew them a map to a false bottom drawer in the cabin's desk. With a search warrant in hand, Halloran and a team of state troopers raided the cabin. And just as Evan Ross had described, they found the drawer. And inside the drawer, they found the ledger. The names of the children had been redacted, but the payments were all there. huge sums of cash flowing into a shell nonprofit controlled by Wade Carver. The paper trail was now an ironclad case. The DA, seeing the ledger, had no choice but to move. Wade Carver was arrested quietly at his home. The charges precise and clean: fraud, falsification of documents, and conspiracy. There was no mention of kidnapping, no gore, just the cold, hard facts of a financial crime. The arrest sent a shockwave through Cedar Ridge. The news was still churning. The town still trying to reconcile the two versions of Wade Carver, when the final piece of the puzzle walked through the front door of the police station. A woman was waiting in Halloran's office. She was in her early 40s, with short, dark hair and the same calm, observant eyes that Halloran remembered from old photographs. She sat with a careful, still posture, a woman who had learned to take up very little space in the world. When Halloran walked in, the woman stood. "Detective Halloran," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "My name is Elaine Cross, but I was born Lena Whitcomb." The air left the room. It was her, older, weathered by time and secrets, but it was undeniably her. Over the next hour, Lena filled in the final blanks. She explained how she'd seen the toddler at mile 23, how she'd recognized the signs of a child in distress, and how she'd realized the camp was a sophisticated, predatory front. In a moment of pure instinct, she had taken her chance. During a chaotic moment when Carver was distracted, she had slipped the child away, taking him from the station wagon during a supposed bathroom break. She knew she couldn't go to the police. Carver was too powerful, his story too polished. So she activated her own emergency plan. She used a network of contacts from her college activist days to connect with a church-affiliated attorney who specialized in protecting endangered children. They placed the boy, whose real name was Noah, with a safe, pre-screened foster family far away, under a new identity. Then, Lena simply ceased to exist. She became Elaine Cross, moving from town to town, working odd jobs, staying off the grid, all to ensure that Carver could never trace her, and through her, find the child. She stayed hidden until Noah was a legal adult, old enough to be safe, old enough to choose for himself if he ever wanted to know his own story. The 15 postcards she'd sent to Mike were her lifeline, a silent countdown. 15 cards for 15 of Noah's birthdays, each one a small, private confirmation to her brother that she was still out there, still watching, still waiting for the day it would be safe to come home. She had risked everything, given up her entire life, for a child she didn't even know. And now, she was back to finish what she had started. The end, when it came, was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet and methodical, just like the case Detective Halloran had built. In the courtroom, faced with Lena's testimony, Evan Ross's confession, and the undeniable proof of the ledger, Wade Carver's polished charisma finally cracked. His lawyers, seeing the ironclad paper trail, advised him to take a deal. He pleaded guilty to a bundle of fraud and conspiracy charges, avoiding a messy public trial. He received a lengthy prison sentence and was ordered to pay restitution, his name now synonymous not with charity, but with deceit. The community of Cedar Ridge, humbled and shocked, began the slow process of healing. The donors who had once flocked to Carver's side quietly redirected their funds to legitimate youth services, this time demanding transparent audits and background checks. The name North Fork Youth Treks was erased from the town's memory, a painful lesson in the dangers of trusting charm over character. Evan Ross, for his cooperation, received a lenient sentence. He later agreed to work with child advocacy groups, his quiet, shame-faced testimony becoming a powerful tool to educate other communities on how to spot the tactics of predators who hide behind the mask of doing good. But the real healing happened not in the courtroom, but in the quiet moments on a familiar front porch. One evening, as Lena and her mother sat watching the sunset, Ruth turned to her daughter. "Can we keep the porch light on?" she asked softly. Lena looked at her, confused. "We don't have to wait for anyone anymore," she said. Ruth shook her head, a small, sad smile on her face. I know, she replied. I don't want it on for fear anymore. I want it on for welcome. And in that moment, something shifted. The light was no longer a symbol of loss, but of return. Of a family made whole again. The reunion was not without its scars. One afternoon, working together in the yard, Mike finally found the words he'd been searching for. He stopped, his hands dirty with soil, and looked at his sister. I'm sorry, Lena, he said, his voice thick. For all those years, for lying, for letting Mom suffer. The promise, it ate me alive. Lena looked at him, her eyes full of a deep, complicated love. I know it did, Mike, she said. And I'm sorry I asked it of you. We both lost years we can't get back. It wasn't a perfect absolution, but it was real. It was an acknowledgement of the shared cost of her courage and his silence. And it was enough. A few weeks after the sentencing, Detective Halloran stopped by the Whitcomb house. She found Lena sitting at the kitchen table, studying a map. You know, Halloran said, leaning against the doorframe, that paper trail you left. The compass, the key, the tape, the cache. In all my years, I've never seen anything like it. It was the one undeniable proof that made the whole case stick. You gave us a story no lawyer could tear apart. Lena just nodded, a quiet validation for a plan she had designed in fear and desperation 15 years earlier. The final piece of closure, however, came not from the justice system, but in a simple hand-addressed envelope. It arrived one morning, addressed to Ms. Elaine Cross Lena at the police station. Halloran brought it over herself. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a photograph. The letter was from a young man, a college student. He wrote that he had been contacted by the lawyer his adoptive parents had always used, and that he had been told the story of his own past. He wrote that he had grown up loved and safe, and that he wanted for nothing. He just wanted to say thank you to the stranger who had saved him. The photograph was of his dorm room. On his neatly made bed, propped against a pillow, was a worn, much-loved stuffed dog. That evening, Lena walked by herself to the river overlook, the place where she used to go to think. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. She took the old brass compass out of her pocket. It felt warm in her hand. She opened the lid, watched the needle quiver, and then settle, pointing true north. She stood there for a long time, just breathing, the quiet heroine of a story that was finally over. The next day, Ruth, Mike, and Lena went to the hardware store together. They bought a new porch light fixture. Not a single bare bulb, but a proper lantern, warm and welcoming. They installed it together, a small, quiet ceremony of their own. That night, and for all the nights to come, a new light shone from the Whitcomb house. It was a low, steady glow that spoke not of waiting, but of being home. Inside, on the fireplace mantel, sat two objects, a small, tarnished locker key and a brass compass, its work finally done.